Hello and welcome to another edition of Truth is Making a Comeback, a production of LibertyNation.com. I'm Lisa K. Donner. On today's episode, bye-bye Cuba. U.S. travel restrictions are now in place. We will have a former U.S. ambassador who has traveled to Castro's paradise join us. Anti-Trump protests in London fizzle into a carnival of oddities. Laura Valkovic and Mark Angelides were on the ground there and will be joining us. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. From Patsy to Pariah, highlights from an Ellen exclusive interview with George Papadopoulos. And the view of ignorance. What's wrong with these ladies on ABC? All this and more on Liberty Nation TV. Stay tuned. The Trump administration announced its intention to impose travel restrictions on Cuba. As of June 5th, cruises, private yachts, and fishing vessels will not be permitted to visit the communist island. Despite the fact that Cuba is only 103 miles as the crow flies from a U.S. shore, relations have been strained since Cuban strongman Fidel Castro took power. The Cuban people largely live in a time machine with cars and such dating back to the late 1950s. And it seems that every president views our communist neighbor differently. In an effort to provide more light than heat, Liberty Nation presents this brief retrospective of Cuban-American relations, which I hope you will find informative and fascinating. Joining me now is former U.S. Ambassador to Costa Rica, Kurt Windsor. Mr. Windsor has long been considered a top U.S. expert on Central America. He has a Ph.D. in Latin American history, and he was asked by the Trump campaign to advise them in 2015. A Reagan appointee, Ambassador Windsor has traveled to Cuba and is here with us now. Welcome to Truth, Ambassador.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, let's jump right in. From the time of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 until 1977, things were pretty frosty between the U.S. and Cuba. Then in 1977, Jimmy Carter took what's been termed as a modest diplomatic step, which permitted diplomatic communication, I believe. Then in 1980 came the messy Mariel boat lift. In March of '82, President Reagan got tough on Castro, designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Geez, there's just been a long route between the U.S. and Cuba. Do you remember anything about those days, Kurt?
Pretty much. Of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis would have been the high point of it, or low point, depending on your point of view, in terms of fear and loathing and consequence. But actually, the Cuba has been, since the Platt Amendment in 1898 or 1899, has been a major focus of the United States and Latin America, because a lot of Americans owned land in Cuba. In fact, there's quite a history, if you don't mind my rambling a bit, of American involvement in Cuba at an economic level. We owned most of the productive land in Cuba. American individuals and corporations did. And that ultimately created a certain amount of vulnerability for the United States to the developments that would occur with the rise of Castro.
Well, that's very interesting. In 1985, the U.S. fired up something called Radio Marti and began broadcasting to Cubans. But the Cubans then jammed the frequency, calling Marti propaganda. Relations between the U.S. and Cuba then got really bad, didn't they?
Well, I would say, at the risk of sounding somewhat irreverent, that Radio Marti has had generally been a waste of money, because it really did not do anything to damage the Castros. I think the Castros spent more money on it than, in that sense, probably was a good thing, in that it may have taken away from their defense or offense expenditures. But the thing about Radio Marti was that it was supposed to, in effect, create discontent within Cuba, and it generally was so anodyne that it wasn't terribly good at that. It did, I'm told by my Cuban friends, I visited Cuba twice, maybe 3 times, at least twice, And my friends there told me that basically it was viewed as good entertainment, and it was not an effective tool of propaganda to speak of.
Well, before we started this interview, we talked a little bit about the name Martí. Can you tell to our viewers about what that means? They might not be aware of that.
Jose Martí was sort of the father of the Cuban Revolution. He basically was a writer he was of Cuban birth. He lived most of his life in the United States, and indeed did a lot of his work and planning for Cuba in the United States. And then, of course, he went over and became very involved in the Cuban Revolution, and of course, depending on who you talk to, became a martyr or was martyred, or his martyrdom, or some might even suggest his martyrdom was arranged. But he he was killed and became, of course, the hero of first hero of modern Cuba.
Well, as we continue along our retrospective view of U.S.-Cuban relations, in 1992, 41 came along. President George H.W. Bush signed something called the Cuban Democracy Act, which basically ratcheted up the U.S. economic sanctions on Cuba. So what's your take on H.W.'s actions? And in hindsight, do you think those sanctions really worked?
No, I think they were quite vitalist. The Cubans had developed a considerable resistance to them before, whereas Cuba had been a tremendous market for Americans, and indeed playground for Americans, and indeed property ownership point for Americans prior to the revolution. Post-revolution, it was huge amounts of American property were seized. Corporations lost their subsidiaries, which were there to a very alarming extent. It all basically is built on the extent to which Cuba and the Cubans are extremely effective people within the Latin American context. They tend to be leaders, they tend to have initiative, they tend to be hardworking. Some people argue it's because of the part of Spain that their founders came from, but it's a very interesting and very complex story. But I would say Cuba, in many respects, has been one of the focal points of the United States for Latin America, largely because it was such a valuable island. So many Americans did have a stake in it, and it was so friendly.
Well, you bring up some really interesting points. Moving forward, President Clinton began 2 bilateral accords with an effort to slow the flow of refugees coming from Cuba. Kind of interesting to note now as we see what the Democratic position is. But anyway, this is back when the Democrats actually called for restrictions on immigrant flow into the U.S. So Clinton set the number of Cubans entering the U.S. to, I think it was 20,000 a year. He also began a policy called wet foot, dry foot, which meant those caught in the water were sent back to Cuba, and those on dry land were allowed to stay.
If they could get their feet on land, underwater even, they were allowed to stay. It was quite colorful in a sad way. But you have to remember that basically Cuba had become such a tyranny, economic as well as political, that people were fleeing because they could not feed their children. They could not basically feed themselves. It was not just political refugees that you were looking at. It was economic refugees and refugees of every stripe. Cuba, along with North Korea, is one of the few truly repressive regimes left. Arguably, it's Marxist, if any country has ever been Marxist. One could make even an argument that Marxism is an abstract theory that has never really been effectively engaged. But it certainly has been an effective tyranny from the point of view of Cuba's leaders, particularly, of course, since Batista.
Yeah, we could probably include China in that group as well.
Yeah, China would certainly fit in there, although it's a very different model than Cuba. And all things considered, Well, I'd be hard pressed to say which I'd rather be a citizen of. They would both be unpleasant, but in different ways. I suspect Cuba would be a bit better to that.
Coming up to the turn of the century in 1999, we got the messy Elian Gonzalez situation. My family and I were actually on the ground in Little Havana protesting the return of Elian the night before Janet Reno ordered her henchmen and an armed assault to capture the little boy. When the Supreme Court then declined to hear the case, he was returned to Cuba.
I visited Cuba twice, and I visited Cuba as a Freemason, which I'm a third-degree Mason, and was rather active with Masonic groups. And Cuba has, since Jose Marti, who was a very strong Mason, and before, a very strong tradition of Masonry, which has always undercut the tyrannies that have governed Cuba basically since, the turn of the 19th century. Masonry today is still very active in Cuba, and it was active in Cuba in the time of Fidel Castro. In fact, Fidel Castro's father was a Freemason, which is one of the reasons why they were not suppressed. That and the fact that if you tried to suppress the Masons, I think you would incur an insurrection on that island.
So you and Elian Gonzalez both visited Cuba, I guess, only he stayed. How did you find Cuba?
A fascinating country because it's a beautiful place. It's a rich country. The people have tremendous ability. I've been all over Latin America. My doctorate is in Latin American history, and I think I visited most of the countries of Latin America. But I think in terms of sheer ability and in terms of a productive and effective people, the Cubans are really on the top of the heap. They're very hard to beat, and it's not any surprise that the Russians would make good use of them for subversive purposes or for whatever purposes they wanted to use Latin Americans for.
Okay, well, now we're in the 21st century, and Castro and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez became buds, and basically the economic situation in Cuba got a bit better. But nothing really changed until 2008, didn't it, when Fidel Castro turned the country over to his brother Raul, and then President Obama held out an olive branch in, I think it was 2009, by permitting limited travel. But he did keep the trade embargo. There was a tremendous pressure of Cubans wanting to leave Cuba because you have to remember, Cubans are natural entrepreneurs. They truly believe in private sector activity, and they're that being totally suppressed in Cuba, plus the lack of opportunity for their children, created an enormous incentive for people to flee. And when things became more tyrannical, that increased. But I would say there was not a dramatic increase other than maybe when things were relaxed in the United States in people fleeing Cuba. And I think, of course, at one point, Castro thought he would encourage people to flee Cuba because he wanted to get rid of his prisoners and mental institutions, which he did, by the way, infiltrating them amongst the refugees coming to the United States. Right. But didn't Obama then travel to Cuba? In the end, did his olive branches really help things, Mr. Ambassador?
Certainly not. I think it probably, if anything, encouraged the government of Cuba to take advantage of the United States, which the government of Cuba, as opposed to the Cuban people, has always viewed the United States with great contempt.
Well, moving forward, in June of 2017, President Trump reinstated limited travel to Cuba, but did not lift the economic sanctions. Now he's rescinded that and taken away the travel. And basically we have the travel restrictions in place. In your educated opinion, what, if anything, do you think will work with Cuba in the days ahead as we have looked at what hasn't worked thus far?
Well, short of an outright invasion or a military action, given the effectiveness of the tyranny in Cuba, there, I believe, is relatively little we could do. Using propaganda, using indirect methods, will not be an effective tool against the Fidel Castro regime. It can make life more unpleasant for them, make life more difficult for them. But as in the case of most communist tyrannies and people that hate the United States, the elites just pass this discomfort through to their own people. They're not at all affected by it. The problem goes to, in effect, the victimization of the Cuban people, or the people who are in the countries that are so treated. I think it would be very, very complicated, given the depth of the tyranny in that country, to do anything short of without a military component that would be effective.
All right, you've made some excellent points. Thank you for joining us on Liberty Nation's retrospective on Cuban-American relations. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. I hope it helps.
That's former U.S. Ambassador to Costa Rica and Central American expert Curtin Windsor. As everybody in the world knows by now, President Trump was invited by the Queen of England for a state visit on the 75th anniversary of D-Day. It wasn't all bouquets and roses, though, as London Mayor Sadiq Khan provided a welcome atmosphere to protesters. There were supposed to be 100,000 of them, but our Liberty Nation team on the ground in London say it was nowhere near that number. LN's Mark Angelides and Laura Valkovic join me now. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Laura.
So, Laura, let's start with you. You were there. The crowd was supposed to be around 100,000, but what was it really?
Well, Lisa, I would probably estimate there were around 10,000. I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Certainly, the event was much smaller than when President Trump visited last year.
So, Mark, it looked like an odd group of people. What was your take as one who was there? In other words, can you run down the list of loonies?
Sure, Lisa. So there was initially planned to be a group of different groups of what they called themselves blocs, B-L-O-C-S. So there was the Palestinian bloc, the climate bloc, the chlorinated chicken bloc, the Muslimas bloc, the families bloc, the socialist bloc, the communist bloc. All of these different groups were supposed to be in attendance. And what happened was most of the groups didn't attend, or there was only a few people from each one. So it kind of melded into one group thing, one whole group, which was, counts up to about the 10,000 that Laura's just mentioned. In terms of whether they were all loonies or not, I wouldn't say that particularly is a fair thing. There were some genuine protesters there with some genuine reasons. For example, climate change, worries about international trade. But of course, there were also the out and out just haters who seem to revel in the carnival of idiocy.
Point taken, but what we call people who dress up in chicken suits and go out in public in America, we call them kind of crazy.
I'm dressed as a chlorinated chicken.
Tell me a little bit about your intersection with those people, Laura. What were they like? Were they vehemently opposed to Trump, or were they just out for fun?
Hi, this is Laura Volkovic reporting for LibertyNation.com. On the
kind of wacky outfits and kind of performance art aspects were really more to get attention, particularly the chlorinated chicken outfits that we saw. I think they just saw that as a way to get attention for their cause, rather than just doing it for the sake of being crazy.
Send the racist on his way.
I think some people were there just kind of hoping for a fight and to kind of express anger. But a lot of people seem to be there basically for a party.
Mark, we've got to dig into this a little bit. What exactly is the issue with the chlorinated chicken, so that Americans are clear on the British problem here?
Okay, to give you the very brief version, although this will take an article to go into in depth, the chlorinated chicken people are worried that because of Brexit, Britain will no longer be part of the EU, which means that Britain will be susceptible to high-pressure trade deals from, for instance, Donald Trump, who seems to have a very keen business sense, as I'm sure you'd agree. And so with part of that, they think that Britain will end up accepting what's called a chlorine-washed chicken, which is sold in not all supermarkets, but many of the supermarkets in the US. Now, obviously in the UK, 10% of the fruit and vegetables that we get from the EU is also washed in chlorine. So it's not so much the matter of the chlorine that's bothering them, but the fact that a chicken farmer would use chlorine shows that there could be, not will, but could be some poor hygiene practices earlier down the line. So really, when they're protesting this, what they're saying is that we want better quality food as opposed to washed in chlorine, possibly with poor health practices that further before the line.
Well, thank you for illuminating that unusual controversy that Donald Trump is apparently responsible for. But Laura, what was the most surprising event of the day, in your opinion, in Trafalgar Square?
In my opinion, well, one thing that I really noticed was that a lot of people hadn't really made their own signs or their own ways of demonstrating. Some had been very creative and individual and done their own thing. But a lot of the signs were supplied by activist groups or unions or socialist political parties. So it kind of made me wonder exactly how grassroots is the protest movement versus how much is controlled behind the scenes.
Well, that is an excellent point. Mark, did you happen to run across any pro-Trump people?
Certainly did, Lisa.
This is Mark Angelides with LibertyNation.com. We've met up with Pariah again from last year at the last anti-Trump protest.
Yeah, there was a few, not many. They were certainly outnumbered.
Why are you down here today?
I came to protest against the protesters.
Rosie, could you tell us what you're doing out here today?
I'm here because this giant group of people is actually embarrassing our nation right now.
Let's be fair, they're a brave bunch of souls. Right in the middle of the crowd with Israel flags, chanting pro-Trump slogans, POTUS 45. You can see the videos on LibertyNation.com.
Laura, did you run across any people in Make America or Make Great Britain Great Again hats?
There were a couple. The Make Britain Great Again group seems to have kind of dissipated, but there were a few individuals who were still wearing the hats.
I'm here with Rosie, who's very bravely wearing a Make America Great Again cap. Thanks for speaking to us. Oh, Make Britain Great Again cap, I'm sorry. Two peas in the same pot. Yeah.
Now, we did see pictures of helicopters flying about. Mark, can you talk about that a little bit? What's that all about?
Sure. So whenever there's a protest or a march, everything seems to be very controlled in terms of what internet is allowed out. And this is something we've experienced just about every time we've done one of these events, is the helicopters. They're responsible for jamming the internet signals. Now, if you have, for example, the Globocast, the CNN vans, which have their own satellites on, that's a strong enough signal to get out. But for people who are just on the ground with, let's say, not quite their own vans, their own transmitting satellite vans, it's almost impossible to get a signal in or out of the protest or march area. And there's just helicopters circling constantly throughout the day.
Wow, big brother. Laura, in your estimation, was the Trump protest a boom or a bust?
Who are you? 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 Who are you?
Well, perhaps to some degree a bust. They got a lot of attention, and I guess that was probably the goal. But in terms of numbers, on both sides, it seems like people didn't really want to get out there as much as they have previously. There wasn't really, I don't think there was as much kind of outrage on either side. It seemed kind of subdued to me. So I think people are kind of starting to move on with their lives, to be honest.
Mark, do you think that part of it is that Trump was an official guest of the Queen of England?
Well, this actually ties in with something Laura mentioned earlier about the signs and the placards being provided by specific organizations, many of which socialist organizations, the Socialist Workers' Party, for example, who, and this may sound strange to American listeners, but many of these people are socialist Republicans in that they're socialist and they don't want the Queen. They'd rather have it as a republic. So yes, part of it, I would say, is because it was a meeting with the Queen. So this is somebody they don't like because of his, let's say, more free market policies, meeting up with somebody they don't like because they're certainly not royalists. So socialist Republicans, there's a new phrase for our American friends.
Well, thanks guys for a job well done. Go out and have some fun in London.
Thanks, Lisa. Take care.
All right, that's Laura Valkovic and Mark Angelides reporting from London, England. He was the fall guy in the greatest and most pernicious spying scandal in American history. We're talking about George Papadopoulos. In an LN exclusive interview with Washington political columnist Tim Donner, the former Trump campaign operative waxed eloquent about what a long, strange trip it's been. The interview in its entirety airs Sunday, June 9th on LibertyNation.com and selected stations across the Radio America network. Tim Donner, yes, we are related, joins us now with highlights from that fascinating interview. Hi, Tim, and welcome to Truth TV.
Thanks, Lise. Good to be here.
First of all, I got to get the skinny. What was he like? Arrogant, down to earth? Was he what you had expected?
Well, he seemed like a good guy, and still incredulous at the whole thing and how he was set up as a patsy, a fall guy, for a scandalous deep state plot to thwart the candidacy and then the presidency of Donald Trump. I mean, George Papadopoulos, he was a straight shooter in our interview, just the facts, ma'am. But he went deep because it was obvious that I'd read the book. So I think it takes it to a different level. But this was, a nefarious plot right out of a second-rate spy novel. The shadowy depths of the deep state, secret intelligence operatives, sinister foreign agents, fake professors, phony influence peddlers, clandestine meetings, mysterious cash payments, and, above all, constant threats to thwart the election and then the presidency of Donald Trump.
Tim, I have here a couple of clips from your interview that I want to play for our viewers. As far as we can determine, there are three key players: Joseph Mifsud, Alexander Downer, and Stephen Halper, all who intersected with Papadopoulos. We have a clip of each of those meetings. The first one is about the mysterious Mr. Joseph Mifsud. Let's listen.
He is at the epicenter of probably the greatest and most pernicious spying scandal in American history. Joseph Mifsud was introduced to me by a director at a company I used to work for in London. And I told them I'm leaving and I'm going back to Washington. I'm going to be joining the Trump campaign. And they were furious. As soon as I said that to them, their antennas started to spike. I didn't understand that this organization in London I worked for obviously had some connections to the FBI too. And Joseph Mifsud, though I didn't know who this person was, he introduced himself to me as some sort of diplomat from Malta who was connected to the world and that he would be helping the Trump campaign. And later we find out that he was likely working with the CIA or the British intelligence services.
Okay, so it sounds like Papadopoulos was suspicious of Mifsud at the outset.
Well, not really, Lisa. You got to understand, he was a starry-eyed 28-year-old upstart who basically thought he hit the lottery when he was hired by a Trump campaign that, of course, had been shunned by all the foreign policy experts. So a young guy like him got an opportunity that he wouldn't ordinarily get. Mifsud promised Papadopoulos the world. He promised that he would set up a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, promised a lot, delivered nothing. He was, as it turns out, likely a cutout for the U.S. intelligence agencies, a foreign agent, if you will. And what George Papadopoulos discovered over time was that Joseph Mifsud turned out to be, along with Papadopoulos himself, ground zero for this deep state plot. Thus, the name of the book that Papadopoulos has written, Deep State Target.
Next, Papadopoulos meets with Alexander Downer, and this was done in short order after the Mifsud meeting. So let's listen to what Papadopoulos has to say about Alexander Downer.
After Joseph Mifsud told me that the Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton emails, I never told anyone on the Donald Trump campaign. I wasn't there to discuss hacked emails. It's not my business. And I'm not involved in any illegal behavior, and neither is the campaign. So clearly, when I met Joseph Mifsud and he told me this information, I had no idea that that's why he was wanting to meet with me. So then I met an Australian diplomat very suspiciously 10 days after Joseph Mifsud told me this information. And Alexander Downer is one of Hillary Clinton's and Bill Clinton's best friends in the world. When he was Australia's foreign minister, he donated $25 million of hard-earned Australian taxpayer money to the Clinton Foundation.
All right, Tim, what do you say?
Well, Lisa, this introduces another element that has been ignored, of course, by the remarkably incurious elite media, and that is the Clinton factor. This guy, Alexander Downer, identifies as a man who steered millions in Australian taxpayer dollars to the Clinton Global Initiative, the Clinton Foundation. And I suspect that in the days ahead, we're going to find out more information about this. Downer served as the first of two people who then alerted the FBI to the fact that Papadopoulos knew about the Russians stealing information and emails from the Hillary Clinton campaign. Even though, and this is important, George Papadopoulos says he never told Alexander Downer about the Clinton emails and the Russians. He never told him that the fact that Russians had infiltrated the Clinton campaign, according to information he had. So right from the start, it was clear that Alexander Downer was working in conjunction with Joseph Mifsud and the U.S. intelligence agencies.
So just to complete this mysterious trifecta, we have Stefan Halper, who Papadopoulos describes as, quote, a morbidly obese man who seemed to sweat constantly. Okay, let's roll clip 3, please.
Stefan Halper had been trying to set up Michael Flynn as early as 2015, and Stefan Halper has a history of spying on rival campaigns and worked with the CIA. And he wanted to pay me some money to write a report on the energy business in Israel. He introduces me to this assistant who clearly was an agent, and I was very suspicious about her. And that's what Donald Trump has declassified. That's what members of Congress now are openly discussing regarding transcripts of my meetings with informants. And we're going to get to the bottom of who actually was handling this guy and why he was trying to entrap Flynn and me.
Okay, Tim, Stefan Halper.
Well, so it might appear in hindsight that Papadopoulos was suspect of the walrus, as Stefan Halper was called, that his antenna might have gone up, but at the time he didn't, because the reason that the meeting occurred with Halper was that Halper had offered Papadopoulos $3,000 to write a foreign policy paper on a subject totally unrelated to Russia. He was lured to London, and then he was hectored and attacked verbally by Stephen Halper. And I think the conversations, according to Papadopoulos, were likely recorded by Halper. And Stephen Halper is a guy who has a history of spying. He spied for the Reagan presidential campaign as far back as 1980, spied on the Carter campaign. And the things you hear about this most disagreeable man, Stephen Halper, are, I have to say, very consistent from the interactions that I've had over many, many years with Stephen Halper.
What, if any, are your takeaways from your interview with Papadopoulos?
Well, the facts as he lays them out in the book, Lisa, are very persuasive of the idea that there was, in fact, a conspiracy among the U.S. intelligence agencies, the Obama administration, and importantly, perhaps the Clinton campaign, and perhaps even Joe Biden was involved in the effort to prevent the election of Donald Trump. And if by some remote chance Trump was able to win the election, they would be able to cripple his presidency. And you see that ground zero of George Papadopoulos flowered into what became the Mueller special counsel investigation, which balkanized the nation and had the Trump administration back on its heels for more than 2 years.
And finally, how can people hear the entire Tim Donner, George Papadopoulos interview?
Well, we're running a 3-part series on Liberty Nation, which lays out the various elements of this conspiracy described by George Papadopoulos. The entire interview will run on Liberty Nation Radio on Sunday, June 9th. You'll be able to hear it, and it's really must-hear radio. And it'll also be heard along the Radio America network in 36 or so stations across the country.
Thanks so much for joining us, Tim.
My pleasure, Lisa.
That's Washington political columnist Tim Donner, also known as Lisa's Better Half. And now for this week's parting shot. Let me just say at the outset, I owe this segment to the terrific producers of the No Agenda podcast. If you haven't listened to No Agenda, along with The Uprising and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, which are Liberty Nation's podcasts, you're really missing something. So this week, Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak brought up the increasingly sad tale of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. As everyone knows, Mr. Assange is in a lot of hot water in the UK, Sweden, and now in the US. Some consider Assange's release of American classified documents a threat to our national security. And in Sweden, he's wanted on charges of rape that were dropped and then reinstituted. But nowhere is it understood that Assange hacked the DNC server during the 2016 presidential election, except maybe on ABC's TV program, The View. Watch this.
After being holed up, and thank you, in the Ecuadorian embassy for the past 7 years, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has been arrested. He faces charges in the U.S. for conspiring to hack into a classified government computer. WikiLeaks tweeted that he's won dozens of journalism awards, nominated for a Nobel Prize every year since 2010, and this is just a campaign by the CIA to delegitimize and dehumanize him. I was almost said dehumidify him.
That would be a good idea, actually. He's quite the human.
You know, so what do you think it is? Why is this happening? Did he break the law? Was it a problem?
Well, remember what he did originally.
Yeah, tell.
Well, he hacked into the Democrats' computers and helped Trump get elected, basically, by exposing Podesta's emails, and then Comey went after Hillary. And remember that? And
I do. Yeah.
That's why Trump won, basically.
According to the special counsel, the GRU, or Russian military intelligence, was responsible for the hacking. But don't tell Joy Behar that. The facts just might get in the way of her assumptions. Abby Huntsman then chimed in. but not to correct her co-host, and Meghan McCain doubled down on Assange, saying, quote, "I hope he rots in hell." Let's roll the tape.
Trump, in an interview back in 2010, said that he hated this guy and that he thought that he would deserve the death penalty along those lines. Then in 2016, when it was hacking the DNC, he promoted him, said that he loved WikiLeaks and basically promoting the information he was sharing
so if it
about.
works for him, he loves it. If it doesn't work for him, he doesn't
here's the
like
weird
it.
thing, though, is even after praising him, it was under the Trump administration, the DOJ, in 2017, that prosecuted Julian Assange. Obama and Holder could have done that the year before, and they punted it. So that's where I get confused, is where you hear from Trump praising the guy, and then under his administration, they're the ones that actually prosecuted him.
The politics of this have always been completely hypocritical on both sides. Eric Holder, under Obama, decided against pursuing persecution of Assange, of concerns that WikiLeaks was, quote, a journalistic organization that would raise First Amendment issues. Chelsea Manning was granted clemency. Chelsea Manning in 2010 released 750,000 classified and sensitive military documents that put our national security at risk. Under the Obama administration, she was given clemency. This is something that a lot of people who have put national security at first, I put myself in that category, have been warning about and warning about and warning about. And the only time the Democrats started caring is when it started affecting them politically, and Hillary Clinton's emails were released, and John Podesta's emails were released.
Does
and
anybody,
I, for one,
so what's going to happen with him? That's my
So
question.
here's the biggest
I hope he rots in
problem.
hell, starting with that.
Yeah.
He's been called a freedom fighter and a traitor, but any way you look at it, Assange has not been fingered by anyone, save the ladies on The View, as the one who hacked into the DNC servers, which, by the way, even in actual hacking is being questioned now. Could it have been a download instead? But let us stay on point here. A summary of the report, of the Mueller report by LN's Graham Noble, reveals forensic computer evidence proves that the GRU was WikiLeaks' source for the hacked materials. The emails and other documents stolen in these hacking operations were released under fictional online personas like DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0, and then later via WikiLeaks. In June, the DNC admitted it had been hacked. The GRU used DC Leaks' Twitter account to reach out to WikiLeaks and eventually transferred a lot of the hacked materials to WikiLeaks. After Guccifer 2.0 began releasing material, WikiLeaks reached out via Twitter. There's more, much more, and the Mueller report in its entirety is published on LibertyNation.com, so help yourself. The sad, very sad part of all this is that a lot of Americans, especially women, listen to this stupidity on The View and buy it. That's unfortunate, because all the public is getting is bad information topped with poor analysis. So the next time you have a bit of time on your hands, go read a book or something. But whatever you do, don't tune into The View. And that's my parting shot. And that's it for this edition of Truth is Making a Comeback. We invite you to check out our website, LibertyNation.com, where facts matter. Have a great week.
Truth is making a comeback. Visit us at LibertyNation.com.